The Point Prim Lighthouse in the background?
Yes, it is.
Nice.
So welcome everybody to our sixth Outside the Rail session. This is our final Outside the Rail session leading up to the spring session of the legislature, which, as the groundhog says, spring's coming early this year, starts on February 25th. And so we've had a lot of really great sessions with our MLAs. And today we bring you Ole Hammarlund. So Ole is the MLA for District 13, Charlottetown-Brighton, and he serves as the critic for tourism and culture, and he's also our net zero building specialist because Ole has a very rich history as an architect and a green architect. He's been involved in some very famous and groundbreaking projects, such as the ARC on PEI back in, that 1976, I believe. Yeah, and many other green building projects besides that here on Prince Edward Island. And so we're very happy to have Ole today. He's going to be talking to us not about a specific bill that he's bringing up this spring, but about net zero buildings, which is something he's very passionate about, has brought a motion forward to the legislature on a couple of years ago, which has actually led to some significant policy shifts in the government that he'll tell you about. And that can be a very significant contribution to our goals to actually reach net zero. So we're going to find out a little bit more about what that means from Ole. And so without any further ado, I will hand it over to you, Ole.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you for all of those who have taken the time to join this Zoom. For those who haven't heard me already, let me just give a short explanation on what net zero means for buildings. It's really simple. It's a really well insulated buildings. Typically, walls are twice as thick, R40 instead of R20, including basement walls. Windows are triple glazed, R5 or better. Attics, you put as much insulation in as you can, like a foot or two or three. It's a space. And inside, there's lots of things that uses power, cooking, lighting, hot water especially, and you try to reduce power usage for all of those. And all the power required for heating and any power requirements inside is reduced a lot, and it's all produced by solar collectors or a windmill on a yearly basis. So when you add the energy you create with the windmills or solar collectors and deduct what you use in a year, you should end up with a zero bill. That's where the name comes from, net zero. It's not a newfangled concept. Actually, the ARC that I came here in 1974 to build it was a net zero building. But more recently, the PEI Advanced House out on Brackley Road. It's up on top of the hill at Harrington. You may have seen the windmill. The windmill comes on and off depending on how it's doing. You can see we deliberately designed the house like a traditional PEI house because the house can sort of looks any way you want. It's the secret is in the walls and all that. So that house was built 25 years ago using regular carpenters, using off-the-shelf materials. So there's nothing newfangled about the concept. The really good news is that net zero houses kind of pay for themselves. The extra cost depends on the particular building, but usually in the range of 10%, gets paid for by this savings. So it doesn't really cost you anymore. You may have to invest a little more upfront, but in the long run, it's as cheap or cheaper than a regular house. I like to think of net zero as to seat belts and airbags that you have in cars. When you go and look for a car, you don't really pay much attention to those features. You just expect them to be there, and you buy the car because of the way it drives or the color of the outside or what have you, all the extra features. A house should be the same way. The net zero features should just be the standard for a house here in North America. That's what I'm working towards. Maybe that's why have been getting relative little press about net zero, because it's kind of a boring issue. Looking at a net zero house, you would hardly even see that it's net zero. It's just a little bit thicker walls, windows, you can't even tell the difference, et cetera, et cetera. Politically speaking, net zero was my very first motion in the House. When I came into the House, I was, of course, not only a green architect, but I was also a very green politician. Anyway, I was totally inspired by Lynn Lund's first political act, which was to upgrade our climate goals for 2030, which was hard political work, and it was only thanks to lots of demonstrators outside and speeches and the public getting involved that got passed. I decided, well, if we have that goal, we should really start doing buildings right now. So I introduced the Net Zero Now motion, basically asking that all new government funding buildings be net zero starting right now. Why wait? We built about 2,000 buildings, apartments, houses a year, and by 2030 we would have built 20,000 of those. Why not have them all be net zero now, or we'll have to renovate them all in 10 or 20 years? So that was my motion. It was fought tooth and nails by the government. First, Brad Trivers, I think it was, introduced an amendment basically adding a little something saying that, well, the government should try to make buildings net zero, basically making the motion pretty toothless. And then Steve Myers talked it off the floor, which means like he talked for an hour and a half until time ran out. And I don't know if you've been following the legislature, but there's really very little time to actually do something. So for every motion and legislator, there's very little time. So we didn't get to it until the next sitting. That time I was a little more politically astute. I got to talk the Liberals into support it. I got Peter Bevan Bakers to introduce a motion. Instead of doing all government buildings, let's just do one, the next school. And that did indeed pass. And since then, the government has actually started to design the new net zero school. It's designed to be open in 2024. And much to my amazement, not so long after, they kind of took over my agenda, and they're now trying to claim to do even better by saying that they will do total net zero energy by 2030 and be total carbon neutral by 2040, which is 10 years sooner than anybody else. I'm a little bit dubious about whether they mean what they say. They haven't really done anything. They have been in power for 2 years. They are starting one school, and it looks like new planned buildings will be net zero, but they haven't done anything at all yet about the private sector. We have 50,000 existing buildings, whereas there are demonstration projects showing how it can be done. And in energy, of course, isn't all about houses. We have even more energy goes into the transportation sector. And they have bought a few electric buses and electric cars, but we have more than 50,000 cars on PEI. So if you want them all electric in 10 years, well, it's not enough to have 50 new electric cars a year. 500 doesn't really make a dent. You need like 5,000 a year. But that we haven't seen. In agriculture, it isn't any better, or rather, they have done nothing at all. There's probably promising potential in storing carbon in the soil and stuff like that, but not even a demonstration project. So I'm looking forward to the session, and I have no idea of what the government's net zero announcement really means, because they haven't given any details so far. So we'll see. It's all very exciting. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Ole. And so I'm going to invite anybody who would like to ask a question, or maybe make a comment, or maybe share something. Maybe you have your own net zero house project you're working on, or some other ideas in this regard. Feel free to contribute to the discussion. Just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak, you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom to raise your hand, and I'll call on you. So you'll find that if you find the reactions button on your Zoom toolbar, which is usually next to where the chat and all that is, under reactions, raising your hand is one of the things that you can do. And if you can't find that, you can just signal in the chat that you want to speak, or you can also write your questions or comments in the directly into the chat, and I can read those out for you, or call on you to ask your question or make your comment. And I see that there's a few that are already coming in, so that's really great. Before we get into those questions, I just want to ask a couple of clarifying questions to you, Ole. So you mentioned your Net Zero Now motion back in 2019. Can you clarify exactly what you were calling for in that motion? No. Are we frozen here?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you froze.
Okay, sorry, Ole. I was just asking you if you could tell us a little bit more about your motion, the Net Zero Now motion, and what exactly were you calling for in that motion?
Well, in the motion, I thought for a starter that we would just ask for government buildings or government-funded buildings to be net zero, because basically that's something they can do instantly. They can just, it's really quite simple. The government doesn't really have staff. They don't design their own buildings. They ask architects to design it for them, and they can just tell architects, well, this building here, design it net zero, and the architects will do that. They'll call in their consultants and stuff like that. That's what happened when the government called for, say, design for the Canfield building, the federal building in town, which I was also involved with as the lead coordinator.
So basically, you were asking them to do that for every new building they were going to build from now on, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Great. And then you mentioned that motion passed, but it was only amended to call for the next government building to be net zero, which turned out to be the Sherwood School.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit, like you mentioned a little bit in the debate there that you know, Brad Trivers had tried to amend the motion, and then Steve Myers talked it off the floor. Can you tell us a little bit about like what that debate was like, and what the arguments against it were, or the concerns that the government was raising at that time?
They didn't really so much argue against it as either trying to make it a toothless motion like Brad did, or just took it off the floor. I don't think Steve Myers even talked about the motion. He talked about something else. He's very good at that, by the way. And it's really interesting to watch. I know at the last sitting, people got into whether we voted yes or no, or didn't vote. And I don't know how people realize there's a lot of other nuances than just voting yes or no. That includes talking it off the floor, just to keep talking, which you're allowed to. Or if you want to know, a lot of legislators just absent themselves, like going to the bathroom. It's not as apparent as sitting down when voting, but just as effective. But those little details you learn if you follow the legislator closely. There was one person that asked a question I saw, if net zero is only for government buildings. No, it goes for really for anything. Houses, definitely. But you could even have a net zero car. You just had to have collectors on the roof enough to charge up the car when you're not driving it. Net zero is really just the concept that you collect as much energy as you use.
Okay, and that leads me just to the third clarifying question that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll get into all these questions that are pouring in on the chat. So when the government announced the net zero goal for PEI, there were actually two different parts to it. So they have a goal for net zero energy by 2030, and then net zero GHG emissions by 2040. Can you explain the difference between those two different kinds of net zero? What does the government mean by net zero energy as opposed to greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I will try, although with a reservation, as I told you before, the government hasn't really told us what they mean. They're just throwing around these things. But I would imagine net zero energy is similar to the island Samsø in Denmark, where the Steve Myers and other legislators and officials went to visit last year. And there they put in lots and lots of windmills. Now, in their particular case, the energy produced for the windmills kind of offset the energy used by houses and cars, although they have some electric cars there. Most houses are still heated by oil or district heat. And so they're saying, well, the value of the energy that we're sending off the island makes up for the energy that the cars use.
Okay. So even though the cars are burning gas and some of the homes might have been burning fossil fuels, they're producing enough electricity that theoretically, if it was all electric, they'd be able to supply all of their electricity needs. Is that right?
That's right. But I think what the government means in this particular case is that in 10 years we'll produce enough energy locally with solar or wind that will cover 100% of our energy use. And as a matter of fact, that's what it says. I was just rereading the announcement just an hour ago. So of course, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time, for sure. So what that means is that we're sending extra energy off the island when the wind is blowing, and when the wind is blowing, the wind will come back again, provided by New Brunswick Energy. But that in total, our energy balance is that we have provided 100% ourselves. So you have to think a little bit about what that means. We currently produce a little over 25% of our electricity. So that would mean 4 times as many windmills as we have right now. That's a lot of windmills. It's definitely possible, but they better get going. The only thing we have seen so far is one project that was turned down by the local community. So they'll have to think of some better way. And they could look to Denmark for that, where they include the landowners there are basically own the windmill, and the government pays them, helps them put them up, but it's all community and landowner owned there. It's not the government that comes in and do them, and I think there might be a better approach here. We'll see.
Okay.
Then the next thing, that's a more difficult, to have no carbon emissions is a more difficult one to get. Again, they might do some of it with offset, having even more than 100% electricity, and say that'll offset some of the locally emitted greenhouse gases. But the greenhouse gases on PEI includes not just oil and gas, it also includes like cows farting and other things like that nobody has really quite figured out how to deal with. So that is a difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, I was just looking at the government has a slide presentation kind of about the net zero goals, and they basically define net zero greenhouse gases as being that we're producing no more greenhouse gases than our environment can absorb. So it sounds like, you know, it might still involve emitting some greenhouse gases, but as long as our, you know, soils or forests are able to absorb that it would still be considered net zero. Is that a correct understanding?
That is a good understanding, and in fact, one of the most effective ways of reducing greenhouse gases is indeed to plant trees on what used to be agricultural land. But I don't think anybody really wants to do that on PEI. There might be some sensitive areas like low-lying marshy areas where one could plant trees, but I think agricultural practices are still very essential to PEI. So we don't really want to reduce that too much. I think we want to drive out the roads and see working farms, not just trees. What was I going to say? Well, in the past 2 years I've been in government, they have been sort of speaking out of both sides of the mouth. On the one hand, they have been installing a fair amount of chip burners in official buildings, and doing a lot of clear cutting for the chips. And then on the other hand, a different department is claiming they're saving the world by planting trees on a few hundred acres of land. It somehow doesn't add up to me, but that's what's happening so far. I think they're planning to plant 200 hectares or 400 acres of woods in a year type of thing, which is all well and good. I think most people cutting down trees plant new trees anyway, so I don't quite understand why it suddenly becomes a save the world action. But
Maybe
the thing is,
to be net zero trees.
the thing is, when you cut down woods, particularly mature woods, it all depends on where the trees go. If it's used for lumber, that's one thing, because lumber is one of the few things where it actually stays, gets stored for a long time. So I'm all for using wood in buildings, but if it just gets chipped and burned, it just means we have a big cloud of CO2 going up very fast, and creating new woods that store significant amount of wood. It takes decades even to get the trees going, so they start absorbing something every year, and it might take a century before
Mm.
all the carbon is back into the trunks again.
Yeah, I saw right recently somewhere that something like the vast majority, like 80 or 90% of a tree's carbon absorption happens kind of in the last, once it's very mature, after decades,
That's right.
the last part of its life essentially. So, okay, so we have lots of great questions coming in through the
Jordan.
chat.
Bobar.
Oh, sorry. Somebody needs to be muted there. So we have a lot of questions coming into the chat here. And I'm just going to remind you, if you want to ask something out loud or, if you have a comment or something you want to share, just feel free to raise your hand. You can do that by finding the reactions button on your Zoom toolbar, and you'll see the raise hand thing there. And you're also welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. And I just want to let you know, and Maria has mentioned this in the chat here. Maria Rodriguez is volunteering to take notes about oral questions and comments in the chat, so that it's easy for everybody to follow along, and so that we can preserve this as well, because we're recording this session and we'll be able to record all the chat comments. So we'll have all those ideas and things that are coming up. So first of all, we have Pauline. She's asking a question that I was also wondering about, which is whether you can explain the difference between passive solar and net zero houses. Is that the same thing, or is it just different terminology?
It's different terminology, and it's kind of developed by different people. Passive house comes from Germany, which incidentally is a lot warmer than Canada. It's very interesting that Canada seems so little concerned with energy that none of the technology really has been developed in Canada. Anyway, passive house is insulated even better than a net zero house. Instead of 40 walls, they might be 60. Instead of having 4 inches of foam under the slabs, they have 8 inches of foam. And the focus isn't so much on, or there's no focus on solar collectors. It's not that they're not allowed, but it's not part of the designation, if you will. Windows, of course, are limited in size and oriented south. And we have a couple of passive houses here. I believe, I haven't seen it, but I believe our minister, Steve Myers, built one last year. And I saw one over in Stratford a couple of years ago. So they are built here. So they're contractors that are familiar with it.
Yeah, I know that Patrick Levesque, who works in the office of the office of the official opposition, he built a passive house just a few years ago, right?
Actually, I didn't know that, but
yeah, I think he was maybe the second one on the island.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that explanation there. And then that kind of segues into the question Jeannie was asking, whether there are contractors building net zero housing right now.
Well, I just had to build a small 1,000 square foot house last year. So that was a local contractor that built that. He's working out in Lansing. That house was built out of local wood. For instance, we cut down the trees and had them milled into 2x6s and 2x4s and siding on the site. So that was kind of local in more ways than one.
Oh, that's awesome. And Linda was wondering, on average, about what kind of a cost would it add to the overall cost of a building if you were to make it net zero?
Well, I use the average figure of approximately 10%.
Okay.
But it varies. It's easier to make big buildings like schools and apartment buildings are a lot easier to make net zero because they have less surface and it's a surface that's expensive. That's where you have to put the insulation. That's where you need the triple glazed windows, but so there's the extra cost in this insulation, but the interesting happens, which is why you can't you can't do net zero halfway. You have to go for it and do it all. And when you do it all, then you no longer need other stuff that you normally put in buildings, like a heating system. You don't really need a heating system per se. There's so little heat left that on most days it's never on, and when it is on, it can be handled by a couple of small electric heaters or coil in the floor or what have you. There's some savings as well.
Okay, that's awesome. Do you have any idea about, for the typical home, how many years it might take to kind of recoup that extra 10% upfront cost from the savings?
I would between 10 and 20 years. And I've spoken to I spoke to our credit union, and they said that they would consider lending the extra money because the yearly heating costs figure large on the expense side when the owner has to put in his budget. So he felt that he could boost, put in some extra few $1,000s to finance the extra cost. So there's really two costs, and you can separate them out. If you don't put the collectors on, then you're talking about a net zero ready house. And the solar collectors fairly readily put on afterwards, and typically will represent about half the extra cost to put the collectors on the roof.
Okay. So that sounds like a pretty good good investment to make. Talk to the credit union if you're about to build a net zero house.
Interestingly enough, when you have a net zero or passive house, the heating the house is a really small. There might be like a tenth of the energy budget. As a typical house, you could probably heat with a couple of plug-in electric heaters when you need them, and it's much more difficult to deal with some of the other stuff. Like most of the energy you'll probably spend on heating your domestic hot water, depending on how much you love showers and hot tubs. That's where all your energy will go.
Okay. And I'll bet you that sorry, no, I just lost my train of thought, but Claudia here has a question, whether there are any government incentives for net zero home projects right now.
Not directly. Go to Efficiency PEI. They have lots of subsidies. Strangely enough, they still subsidize oil burner, for instance, but there you go. It's the government after all. What do you expect? But they will help you to pay for insulation and collectors. They won't really recognize a net zero structure per se. It's not one of their goals. You don't get more money for net zero, but they will pay you money. I think up to 40% cash for solar collectors, for instance, is very significant, and up to $5,000 for any number of energy saving features in the house. But redefine print. You have to. As I said, it's easy to save on the insulation, but a lot more difficult to save on the hot water, domestic hot water, and to reach their goal, you have to do that as well.
Okay, and so do you know if that up to $5,000 available for efficiency upgrades, is that available on new builds as well? And is it kind of means tested? Like, does it depend on your income, or is that just available to anyone?
They have a lot of programs, and I don't know exactly the details, but yes, it goes for new as well as old houses. The numbers I mentioned were for new stuff. And it is mean tested. They'll give you a lot more if you're low income, and in some cases they'll pay almost the whole thing, depending on the situation. They'll come in and redo the house for you, if need be.
Okay.
But in my opinion, we need a lot more. Like as I mentioned before, we have like 50,000 existing buildings here, and there's no particular program or even help, even design help to how to deal with that. I was walking up on Upper Prince Street last winter. There was 3 houses going through completely replacing the exterior skin and completely replacing all the windows. A perfect opportunity for going to net zero, because that's the kind of thing you have to do to make existing building net zero. But they didn't go for it. They just put new shingles over Tyvek without putting in the extra, 4 inches of insulation that would have been nice and would have made all the difference. And they put in regular double glazed windows. And there isn't even a suggestion that people should think about that. And it would in fact pay for itself, but in the long run, but it takes some upfront money. Some buildings, old buildings, are more difficult than others. Buildings like the Beaconsfield, for instance, you can't really go in and replace everything. It would destroy it as a heritage building. So you have to think of other ways there. But most buildings can be upgraded one way or another.
So that is a good segue into Omer's question. I know Omer's working on an older house. He's asking what it generally would take to convert an old house of less than 1,000 square feet to a net zero home. What kinds of things would you have to be looking at doing?
Well, I don't know, but it's a lot more expensive with an existing home. I would say it's about double, because and in some places more. Like for instance, with the difference between a new triple glazed window and a new double glazed window isn't very large. It's maybe $5 extra, or $5 to $10 extra per square foot. But if you have to take the old window out and throw it away and put a new one in, you're speaking like $100 a square foot or more. So you're speaking tens of thousands of dollars, maybe like $50,000 to do it.
So do you think that notwithstanding that, if you were in government and looking at what kinds of programs to offer to help people lower their energy use at home, do you think that incentives or support for retrofitting existing homes would be the way to go, or should the focus more be on kind of new homes and renewing the housing stock, or what would be the best from a emissions reduction standpoint?
That's a really good question. Everybody loves a government subsidy. There's nothing like going to the government and getting a big grant to do the stuff you want to do anyway, which has worked really well on heat pumps. That's why you see everybody putting in heat pumps. They get a hefty bit of it paid by other taxpayers, even though all the benefits are yours. You get the savings. I'm not quite sure when you have to go in, and if the plan is to do all the houses on PEI, there's no longer a group of taxpayers that pays for your house. Everybody has a house. Everybody needs a subsidy. So I don't think subsidy is the way to go for that kind of scale. I think it needs the financing method needs to be set up. Maybe access to some low interest financing, and the key thing is is help doing it, guidance, training of carpenters that does it. I think new houses, the building code should simply be upgraded. So it's a new requirement, just like in the old days, you had to have 3-foot wide stairs and what do you call it? Fire alarm system. Now it has to be net zero. I don't think we can afford per se to finance it for people because, the people, they are us if you're doing everything. It doesn't make any sense to me. And you could do ingenious financing. For instance, the government right now finances windmills. They will happily go out and spend $20 or $30 million. They can finance it at 2% or less because they're the government.
Yeah.
And they could do that for insulation too, and collect it through property taxes, for instance. There's all kinds of ways it could be finagled. It's really a little bit beyond my expertise, but there's definitely ways to do it.
Yeah, I think
the government has to figure it out.
I was reading about, I think it's Tatamagouche in Nova Scotia that has a municipal program that basically finances some of these kinds of energy, like efficiency upgrades, home retrofits, and then kind of you repay it as add-on to your property tax over time out of the savings, out of the energy savings that you realize from those investments. So is that kind of a role that you see that the provincial government could be playing, but on a larger scale?
That is definitely one of the ways. I have asked the government to use those ways. It was actually, I don't know if it was part of the actual motion, was definitely part of the discussion, but when I asked Steve Myers how he was going to finance the new school, he said, "Oh well, we'll just took it out of budget." Well, the effort, if you're going to reach the goals we have set, is going to be like hundreds of $millions a year needs to be spent. So where's it going to come from? Obviously, we're not going to cut the budget in other areas or tax more. It's going to have to be found in some way that makes economic sense for PEI. If done correctly, it can actually boost the economy.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of jobs there, right?
It's a lot of
For one
jobs,
thing.
and they have to be found. Right now, there's actually a shortage of construction workers, but it's just a question of paying them a little bit more, I think. But we'll see. We need to get Albertans travel out here to PEI to build net zero homes instead of us going out there and build oil rigs for them.
Yeah, I think there's more than a few Albertans that are looking for jobs now. So yeah. So Ole,
Jordan, sorry, in what jurisdiction of Nova Scotia is this program? You mentioned it and I missed it.
I thought it was in Tatamagouche.
Oh, in Tatamagouche, okay.
Yeah.
I think they're doing it for solar collectors. I've heard in Halifax as well. Basically, you somehow the financing is secured by property taxes.
Yeah, Nova Scotia seems to be doing some innovative things there. And so Maria actually had a question kind of related to what we were just talking about. So she asks, what is the Green Caucus doing in terms of advocacy to improve the structure of current government incentives? And she says some of it makes little sense. So you mentioned a couple of incentives. There's incentives on solar collectors. There's some efficiency incentives that are available. There's heat pumps. Is there anything there that you think, or that the caucus has been advocating to change or restructure?
Well, we certainly have been, Steve Howard in particular has been advocating more funds for solar collectors, and indeed the government has increased the pot there. They ran out very fast, and they increased the pot there. But the energy efficiency is more or less financed federally, so and it's based on a federal provincial agreement made 4 years ago, long time ago, by the previous provincial government under Wade, so, or maybe it was even earlier. And it's difficult to change, probably not as difficult as the Conservative government thinks, but so they can't, basically, they are renegotiating it right now. They're keeping it completely under, they don't tell us anything they're talking about. Dennis King has hinted they might be talking about carbon taxes, but if you look at the disaster of carbon taxes negotiated last time, was basically that we use taxpayers' money to pay the federal carbon taxes, so the islanders won't see any tax increases of the gas. That's what we have right now. It's like a third world country here in terms of the agreement we have currently. No, there's not much we can do. At this point, it's really up to the government, and we're unfortunately not in on the negotiations, or they would look a whole lot different. And the government, the provincial government, really has no excuse, regardless of the deal they made with the feds. There's taxation of gas is completely up to them. They could have raised gas taxes, 10 cents a liter. Who would notice, really? And done all kinds of stuff like that if they had wanted to.
Okay, thank you, Ole. Now, Linda had a question, just kind of veering off the path of talking about buildings, but still on the net zero energy. She's asking if anyone on PEI has done feasibility studies on offshore wind turbines. She said she doesn't know of any places where they're used and the sea freezes. Is offshore an option for PEI, as far as you know?
Ice definitely would increase the cost, because you would need to strengthen the base and have shields similar to what you have at the Confederation Bridge. And offshore windmills in general are more expensive to begin with, by at least 50% more. I think we still have space on PEI, spaces where we are not destroying our beautiful landscape, where you could put windmills. That would be the first choice for sure. Denmark doesn't quite have the same kind of ice problem. Everybody's very excited about building a huge amount of windmills out in the North Sea, all connected up to an energy island, as they call it. We'll see when that comes. That's just a promise at this point here, but everybody's very excited about it.
Okay, so it's largely a question of cost and also the potential that ice could create problems there, right?
Problems are, I don't think they couldn't be solved. It would just add to the cost. So maybe it would be twice as expensive as building it on land.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now, windmills is actually one of the cheapest ways to produce energy, except it's of course not continuous. So we PEI, as far as I'm concerned, we just need to hook up to either Quebec or Newfoundland hydro to fill in the gaps, and we'll be all set.
Okay, so getting back to buildings now, I see that Pauline had another question later on asking, what prevents somebody like Tim Banks, a developer with APM, from building net zero buildings? I guess why aren't more developers getting sort of on board with net zero buildings right now, do you think? Or do you think that that's coming soon?
Well, I was up looking at an apartment building by the Arsenal family up in Summerside. It's a big 7-story building right in the waterfront. It's not super attractive. It's actually really well built, including, lots of insulation, but they just didn't take that extra step to make it net zero. Like the windows are not triple glazed, and the insulation just needed a few extra inches of insulation. I suspect the reason they're not doing it is because developers in general, they're looking for high returns on their money, like in the range, 5%, what do you call it? 5-year payback or something like that, if they can do it. Or, they don't have the kind of long-term money. You kind of have to force them into it, and it will come. But I think you have to twist their arm, just as you have to twist their arm, getting them to do anything else nice.
Okay, and then Pauline brought up a really interesting policy that that she saw at work in Ireland, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that. So she was sharing that in Ireland, a house had to have an energy rating when it was for sale to indicate how energy efficient the house was. And this energy rating then became a selling point, which encouraged people to build or renovate in order to get a better rating. Is that something that you think could be a one way of incentivizing people to build more energy efficient buildings on PEI?
Yeah, that would help. I think we need more than that. We had sort of the beginning of that kind of rating with the houses built by 2000 buildings, which brought houses up to a certain level. And people, when they do buy houses, energy definitely plays a role. Any buyer worth his salt asks for the oil bills for the past year to see what he's in for. But for total transformation into net zero, I think we need more than that. But energy rating definitely would be a good beginning.
Okay. And going back to the question of incentives and subsidies and things, Jeannie was asking whether there's an argument for giving subsidies to people who have high incomes, such as for solar panels and heat pumps. And I know that this is something that comes up in discussions around electric vehicle subsidies as well, since right now, at least, it's primarily people that have higher than average incomes that can afford those vehicles as they're priced right now. Do you have any thoughts on how people's income and subsidies like this should work, or incentives?
I have a real problem with subsidizing high income people, whether it's for houses or for cars. I think we need to. The reason everybody's speaking about guaranteed basic income is because we have a real problem here. There's just too many people that can't make ends meet. So I think the last thing we want to do is to spend public tax money subsidizing people who already have enough and who will already realize savings if they do it without subsidy. You don't need a subsidy to realize the savings.
Yeah, it's just a good investment to make, if you've got the money. So now Darcy mentioned something in the chat here, which brings up a really good, another good question about incentives. So she points out that right now there's no incentive for existing apartments to get off oil because the landlord is often getting the tenants to pay for the oil, and so they don't really care about the cost. So I know that that's called the problem of split incentives. And I'm wondering if you know of or can think of any approaches that can address that. So to give landlords more of an incentive to to invest in renewable energy or energy efficiency, and then to hopefully pass those savings on to the tenants as well.
Yeah, I have a radical thought on that. I think the good landlords, the people that do care about not only their tenants and the buildings and take care of them, okay. But people that have just left the apartments sink into the ground and not done any renovations. My personal feeling is that those apartment buildings should gently be separated from the landlords and under some kind of program should be completely renovated and turned over into like a owner equity co-op or something like that, where the people living in the building actually own their units, which now are going to be very modest in terms of keeping. I think something else should happen. There's way too many tenants living in poorly maintained buildings. I think things need to change on a whole different level. And
Okay, that's
I
for
think
obviously.
I think equity co-ops would be one way to go, or turning them into some other way where the tenants have control and have the building be renovated with the help of the government. But I hate to see government money to go in to help renovate buildings for landlords. I just don't see that.
Okay, thanks. And I see Darcy's got her hand up. Darcy, do you want to go ahead?
There we go. There we go. Sorry, oh, so gently. We'll just expropriate those buildings so gently. That's lovely, Ola. I'd like to do that too. I have had some success recently with apartment buildings. A lot of the new apartments that are going up just in the north of Houston area are putting solar on the roof. I've had some luck with there's a condo on Prince Street that's looking at solar, actually, and then another apartment building looking at solar. And some of them are just for common area costs, which is a good start. So that's the landlord. And some of them are for whole building, if they're all heat pumps, they're for whole buildings.
Yeah.
What I'm coming across in apartments, kind of a newer trend, where the landlord has put a heat pump in the unit that's included in the rent. So it's renting heat included, but there's some backup electric baseboards that are on the tenant's own meter. So the heat's included to a point.
Yeah.
If you want to have it at 80 degrees, that's on you. And I find that's a really good model. So I've been talking to a lot of landlords just about solar and energy, and I always add some energy info when I go see a landlord. And what we've just found out in the past month is that Efficiency PEI will support a landlord who puts solar on the roof of a residential apartment. So that's a big step forward. They weren't doing that before because
That's
it's
wonderful.
residential.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we need a postcard campaign to landlords.
That could be my next one. I have these ideas almost at the point.
Yeah. Did you know?
Lord knows.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Darcy. That's really encouraging. And I see that we've just reached 8 o'clock, and I don't see any other questions in the chat or hands up. So that might be a good time to wrap it up for the evening. Oh, Ola wants to say something now.
Well, I just want to say thank you for everybody who contributed really good questions, and also, I'm always looking for input if anybody wants to, be part of a group working on net zero energy or anything related to that or housing. Please contact me. I'm always looking for input, and again, thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you very much, Ola. And that's I know there's a lot of people interested in that. So we'll send out a follow-up to everybody who registered for the session today, and include your email address so they can get a hold of you if they're interested in being part of this conversation more ongoingly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Maria, for taking great notes in the chat, and to everybody else for contributing your questions and comments and policy ideas. And this is the last of our Outside the Rails sessions, but I know all the MLAs have really enjoyed these conversations, and they're looking forward to doing these more like these. And we've got lots more topics that are going to come up probably after the spring sitting is over, or maybe even there's a break actually built into the spring sitting right now in March. So so we might see some things there. So stay tuned, and we'll keep you posted on everything coming up. Have a good one, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
Right.